There's something beautiful about the simplicity of the adage that tells us that history is written by the victors. Certainly there is truth in it. Despite centuries of cultural turnover, the Romans are still generally favored over the Carthaginians, the Union's victory over the Confederates is seen as a technological inevitability, and the Allied triumph over the Axis powers is consistently portrayed as one of the single greatest instances of good defeating evil in the history of the world. And if you were to walk into most American history classrooms in the U.S. today and pick up a textbook, you would likely find, in regards to the end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, a neat little paragraph that goes something like this, quote, "The sudden and unexpected collapse of communism marked the end of the Cold War and a stunning triumph for the United States and its allies. For the first time since 1917, there existed a truly worldwide capitalist system. The sudden shift from a bipolar world to one of unquestioned American predominance promised to redefine the country's global role." End quote. Thanks to this perspective, the Soviet experiment, and communism as a whole, is seen by the vast majority of the American public as a flawed and futile experiment in the face of human nature, common decency, and good sense, and can therefore be dismissed entirely to the annals of history class. This perception leads to two implicit assumptions. The first, that Soviet communism was a bad system that did not work for its people, and the second, that American capitalism is a good system which does. 2 years ago, I was inspired to research the fall of the Soviet Union because both of these assumptions were being challenged for me. Looking around at the current economic landscape here in the United States, one would have a difficult time convincing the average person that capitalism was working. Criticism of capitalism is widespread across the political spectrum. During the 2024 presidential election, Vice President Kamala Harris promised voters that she would raise taxes on the wealthiest Americans to help expand social programs, while President Donald Trump vowed to use executive powers to help lower the cost of living. This isn't just political noise. The American middle class, which in 1971 was made up of 61% of all adults, was in 2021 just over 50%. Over half of the adults in the United States in 2024 reported living paycheck to paycheck. Wealth inequality has reached extremes not seen in over a century. In 1991, facing intense domestic pressure, the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union decided to hold a public referendum asking simply, quote, "Do you consider necessary the preservation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics in which the rights and freedoms of an individual of any ethnicity will be fully guaranteed?" End quote. Voter turnout was high, over 80%. And across all 15 of the Soviet republics, over 70% of voters voiced their support for the continuation of the Soviet state. Not only that, but among people living in former Soviet republics today, a phenomenon known as Soviet nostalgia, that is, wishing that the old regime would return, has remained widespread. To me, this begged the question, if Soviet communism was so deeply flawed, why did a vast majority of the Soviet people vote for more of the same? Given all of this, and the fact that the downfall of the Soviet Empire is now almost 35 years in the past, I'd like to reevaluate America's victory in the Cold War. What were the successes of the Soviet Union which contributed to its domestic popularity? What were the failures that led to its collapse anyway? How are the conditions of the American empire today similar or different from its Soviet counterpart in the late 20th century? And finally, how can this reevaluation inform solutions to the problems the U.S. faces today? Let's begin with a brief overview of the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. During the 1980s, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to revitalize the Soviet Union with a series of reforms under the umbrella terms of perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika attempted to alleviate economic problems by opening up the Soviet Union to foreign investment, eliminating regulations, and incorporating elements of a free market capitalist economy that other countries like the U.S. found successful. Glasnost, on the other hand, attempted to reduce censorship and increase freedom of information, even if that meant allowing greater public criticism of the government. Contrary to Gorbachev's hopes, both of these reforms ended up accelerating the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'll start with perestroika, the economic reforms. The basic premise that American narratives provide for the failure of these can be boiled down to the Soviet Union was really bad and it wasn't working, so Soviet leaders tried to make things more like the West, which was working, but they were too late and it all came crashing down. This framing of the history makes several bold assumptions. We can deal with the question later of was the West really working? But for now, I'd like to focus primarily on the question of Soviet economic stagnation, aka the Soviet Union wasn't working. The economic history of the Soviet Union can basically be broken down into two periods, between 1928 and 1970, when the Soviet economy was growing rapidly, even outpacing the economic growth of the West, and then 1970 onward, when the economic growth stagnated when compared with Western economies. Evaluating the performance of the Soviet economy was not just something that the Soviets were interested in doing, of course. The United States also had a vested interest in analyzing the strength of its greatest adversary. From a 1985 declassified CIA report entitled A Comparison of the U.S. and Soviet Economies, Evaluating the Performance of the Soviet System, we can glean further insight into the narrativization of the facts that took place during this period and contributed to Gorbachev's reform activities. The CIA were very aware of the problems facing the Soviet economy at this point, and described them in this report using very capitalistic terms. Quote, "The areas in which the Soviet performances has been the poorest relative to U.S. performance since the mid-1970s are GNP, gross national product, size and growth, per capita consumption, quality of consumer goods and services, agriculture, development and application of new production technologies, and labor productivity." End quote. Again, the failures of the Soviet Union's communist system are put into capitalistic terms. This makes sense if you are the CIA looking in from the outside and addressing U.S. policymakers and political leadership. But critically, these were also the terms that Gorbachev himself was likely thinking of these problems in. Quote, "The Soviets' use of the U.S. economy as the standard against which to measure their own progress is long-standing. In fact, comparisons of Soviet economic performance with that of the United States are given a prominent place in the USSR's major statistical compendium." End quote. Now I think we are prepared to approach some of our central questions. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet economy, at least in terms of GDP, labor productivity, and consumption levels, was not able to keep pace with capitalist economies that the Soviet Union was competing against politically, namely the United States. But even more critically, Soviet leadership at this point determines, by analyzing their problems through a capitalist lens, that Soviet communism must be reformed towards emulating rival capitalist economies for the sake of bridging this gap in performance. The typical narrative given to these reform attempts, as we've seen, is simple from the perspective of the Soviets' capitalist competitors. Too little, too late. Should have tried to be capitalists earlier. But what if instead it was the way they tried to fix the Soviet economy, to make it operate more like a capitalist economy, which led to its demise? Gorbachev and the other Soviet leaders were dismayed by the Soviet Union's economic performance in comparison with that of the United States. But should they have been? Or could it be argued that the slowdown in economic growth was a natural byproduct of the communist system working as it was always intended to? Consider the basic principles of capitalism and communism. Under capitalism, the basic idea is to create incentives that will drive innovation and productivity. Some of those incentives are positive, the carrot, you could say, such as improved living conditions, material wealth, and access to higher echelons of society. Other incentives are negative, the stick, the threat of poverty, starvation, and social failure. In order for a capitalist system to perpetuate itself, it is necessary that some people are suffering when compared with others. Communist thought rejects this incentive structure. It presents the theory that under a system of collectivized labor, the goal is to organize things as efficiently as possible so that every person working within the system has enough to get by. The only incentive necessary for people should be that by working, they are helping themselves, their loved ones, and their country to thrive. Between 1928 and 1970, the Soviet Union proved that this theory could be put into practice effectively. Employment rates rose almost to capacity. Productivity increased as workers were organized by the system so that their labor could be made best use of, and so forth. In strictly communist terms, the slowdown of gross national product growth, consumption rates, and productivity increases are unimportant so long as the system works efficiently enough to provide for the needs of the people contributing to it. Gorbachev's perestroika reforms, though perhaps well-intentioned, did not make sense within the context of a communist system. The strength of the Soviet economy was that, unlike a Western capitalist economy, it did not depend on endless growth to be successful. By reducing regulations and inviting foreign investment, Gorbachev undermined these strengths and accelerated the Soviet Union's decline. Now let's talk about Glasnost, which attempted to expand individual liberties when it came to political speech and freedom of expression. Immediately after the introduction of the Glasnost reforms, there was a widespread public re-examination of Soviet history. In particular, there was a lot of media focus on the regime of Joseph Stalin, who was the dictatorial leader of the Soviet Union between 1922 and 1952, during which time millions of people were imprisoned, executed, or starved to death. Having had all of the information about these crimes suppressed by the government for 70 years, it is understandable why people reacted with outrage, sparking widespread unrest. The reactions of the Soviet people to the revelations Glasnost provided speaks to their widespread belief in the principles that the Soviet government claimed to stand for. When provided with a more accurate retrospective understanding, the people saw it as a betrayal of those principles. These were the ideological failures of the Soviet Union, and while I cannot go into all of them in depth, there is one in particular I would like to highlight, which I think is representative of the rest of them in terms of how it has been narrativized over time. In their 2023 retrospective analysis, The Status of Women in the Soviet Union, Eka Darbaidze and Tamila Niparishvili explore the expectations that the 1917 revolution established for women, the ways in which those expectations helped to fuel the economic boom between 1928 and 1970 that I discussed previously, and the ways in which the Soviet Union's failure to live up to these expectations contributed to disillusionment and eventual dissolvement of the empire. They begin by laying out the advancements, particularly legal advancements, that were made at the dawn of the Soviet era. Quote, "The revolution of 1917 removed all the legal restrictions that had kept women at a low rung on the status ladder, acknowledged gender equality, and guaranteed women's economic empowerment by providing employment. The Soviet Constitution of 1918 proclaimed equal rights for all citizens of the Soviet Republic, irrespective of gender, race, or nationality, and established the right of women to elect and be elected on equal terms with men. In 1920, abortion was legalized." End quote. Even by the standards of the most liberal Western democracies today, perhaps especially by some of those liberal democracies, these are incredible results, and if they had been incorporated successfully, may have provided sufficient ideological justification for the communist revolution in and of themselves. One of the main reasons why these ideological expectations could not be lived up to was due to a reversal in policy under the leadership of Stalin, who, after succeeding Lenin in 1922, abolished committees devoted to overseeing women's issues, made divorce more difficult, and revoked abortion rights. This is another one of the main narratives that gets told about the Soviet Union. It started out okay, and then Stalin screwed it up, and it never got fixed. And in this case especially, I don't think that is an unfair assessment. However, even under Stalin, there were significant advances in the societal role of women when compared to Western countries. In the 1930s, for instance, the Soviet Union had a significantly higher percentage of women enrolled in higher education than did Germany or the United Kingdom. In the end, however, the aspirations of the revolution, as it pertained to women's rights, were never successfully implemented. Women were still disproportionately burdened with the role of homemakers, even as they were pushed into the workforce for the sake of economic growth. The result of this ideological failure, along with all the others that were even more egregious, shocked the Soviet public when they came to light during Glasnost. Allow me to engage you in a brief hypothetical. If, for whatever reason, the United States had lost the Cold War and had been dissolved, how would the Soviet people have come to understand their victory? The collapse of the United States would have been viewed as proof of the triumph of communism over capitalism, of an authoritarian central government over a decentralized Republican one. Decades later, Soviet children might have learned the tale of the doomed capitalist experiment, which encouraged greed, selfishness, and oppression. They would hear accounts of the horrors of chattel slavery, of Jim Crow, and imperialist colonization of what had been cruelly known as the Third World. One could claim that this account would be biased, or even call it propaganda, but it certainly would not be incorrect. Today, the United States is at significant risk of suffering a similar fate as the Soviet Union did in the 1970s and early 1980s, and its problems can be described in the same way. Economically, the United States is full of signs of stagnation and decline. Workers become less productive under a system that they do not feel adequately rewards them for their labor. Healthcare and housing costs have become prohibitively expensive. The nation's aging population is a natural consequence of a labor system that does not provide adequate support for women in the workforce who might wish to start a family. And much like the failed reforms of the Soviet Union, the proposed solutions to these widespread problems by both major political parties in the United States are not nearly sufficient, and in many cases are completely counterproductive. Much like how Gorbachev's perestroika reforms undermined the strengths of the Soviet economy, the raising of tariffs, the abandonment of international free trade, and the stripping of consumer protections undermines the forces that have helped keep American capitalism afloat for over a century. Ideologically as well, the United States has a long history of falling short of its aspirations. It would be one thing if I was making this video in the context of the Biden administration or the now impossible Harris administration. Under Democratic leadership, and historically under Republican leadership as well, the American capitalist system has been egregiously imperialistic and flawed. Over the past half-century, American politicians have become widely viewed as morally corrupt, regardless of party affiliation, largely due to their unquestioning support for controversial foreign policy decisions and the persistent erosion of social programs. The conditions of the American government today, however, is not just one of dysfunction, but of chaotic destruction. We are now witnessing the emergence of a blatantly fascist government in the United States, which, rather than addressing ideological failures of the past, is embracing them. In the first year of the Trump administration, we have witnessed an unprecedented expansion of executive power, a disturbing wave of suppression of free speech, and an absurd level of corruption. It remains to be seen whether or not these massive economic and ideological failures in the United States will have a similar effect on the success of this country as did those of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. My hope is that this video does not function as a means of defending one system or ideology over another. I do not think there is anything to be gained from claiming that capitalism is better or worse than communism, or in comparing the atrocities of imperialist projects operating under the guise of either system. Famine in Ukraine, centuries of chattel slavery, there is no moral equivalency to be found in these things. I don't think it's appropriate or useful to retrospectively condemn the Soviet Union to its fate because of those atrocities, any more than I would condemn the United States and the American people to fascism because of ours, when there are things to be learned from both. I think pretty much any system could, in theory, be organized in such a way as to provide pretty good lives for the majority of people. The question before us, at least in this moment in history, is not over what system should be employed, but rather how best to manage the system we have. And when faced with a question like that, I think it is irresponsible to willfully ignore the lessons that other systems have to offer us, or, in the case of the way communism is viewed in America, to completely write off a system and its goals as ridiculous and unthinkable. The frequently dramatic failure of Soviet communism to live up to the lofty goals it set out to accomplish, the equality of men and women, racial equality, government-subsidized housing, healthcare and other basic services for all, etc., does not mean that those goals are in and of themselves unachievable, unrealistic, or counterproductive, nor does this failure indicate that other countries should dismiss or give up on similar ambitions.